Hi, everyone. We'll get started because I know everyone has studio to get to, but thank you so much for joining us today. Associate Dean for Research, Krupali Cruce, unfortunately was unable to join us here today, but she asked me to read a few words of introduction on her behalf. You all know Professor Richard Economakis. He is our Director for Graduate Studies in the Architecture and Urbanism program here in the school. Richard joined our faculty in 1996 with extensive practice experience from the top firms in London. While his list of research publications is long, including his most recent book, Durability in Construction, Richard has been able to strike a balance between his professional practice and his scholarship. An extensive list of his work and publications is available on the school's website. Today, Professor Economakis will speak about an ongoing urban development project that he has been design consulting on. He is a member of the Estudio Urbano design team and has realized a number of buildings at Cayalá in Guatemala. This new town, which was master planned by Leon Creer, with town architects and Notre Dame alumni Pedro Godoy and Maria Sanchez, was recognized in May 2016 by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art with a prestigious Arthur Ross Award in the field of civic design. In 2015, Cayalá received an International Making Cities Livable Award and the Acanthus Award from the ICAA Chicago Midwest Chapter. Professor Economakis' Civic Hall at Cayalá further received a 2013 Palladio Award. So we welcome Richard as the initiator of our Brown Bag Lecture Series, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and I'm honored to be the first brown bag lecturer, although I forgot my brown bag. I hope that doesn't matter. This is a short presentation, and there's lots to show you. So the way I decided to structure it is really more as a slideshow with some commentary to keep you in the picture. So I'll be happy after this presentation if any of you have any questions or want to know more about the site. I can direct you to literature and further images if you wish. For those of you who want to know where Guatemala is in connection with the United States, it's right down in Central America, just below the Yucatan Peninsula, as you can see. And let's see, what's the best way to... I can probably move the mouse. Can you see the mouse? Right, okay. So the country of Guatemala grabs a little bit of the Yucatan Peninsula, which, if you remember, is the homeland of the Mayan civilization. And to its south are the so-called highlands, where you will find the capital city, Guatemala City. And two of our alumni, Maria Sanchez and Pedro Godoy, who got their graduate degrees years ago, are natives of Guatemala City and were involved in an early effort to convince a developer to, rather than erect a series of residential towers, to actually hire the architect Leon Creer to master plan this residential development and turn it into a model, a neighborhood, model town. And this town is on a site very close to Guatemala City, as you can see on the map. And it's known as Cayalá, which is a Mayan word, the Mayan language being alive and well in many areas of Guatemala. Cayalá means paradise in Mayan. It just happens to be the name of the hills on which this town is located. So Paseo Cayalá, or Cayalá Street, is the official name of the town. To put you further into the picture, you can see here Guatemala City on a Google Earth aerial view, a map, and you can see the foothills, the Cayalá foothills here, facing due west, with the new town of Paseo Cayalá developing right here. Now, this map is a very early 2003 map by Leon Creer in collaboration with Estudio Urbano, Pedro Godoy and Maria Sanchez principals. They collaborated with Leon, having invited him to a number of charrettes. And you can see here what the intention is, and this is roughly to scale with the aerial view behind. So you can just get a sense it's deployed along the edge of the hills here, overlooking Guatemala City. And you can see that it's broken down in very traditional manner into a series of neighborhoods, which are approximately 10-minute walk in diameter, which all have a clear center and an edge. Some of these neighborhoods, these cells, are built up with existing buildings, and so they're going to be a little bit harder to structure. But the whole intention is, since the developer owns much of this land, the intention is to transform these gradually over time into a necklace of neighborhoods that make this larger urban entity. Now, the area that we will be concerned with is right here. The Cayalá area, and another area down here, which is known as El Socorro, is currently under development, and I will try and get to show you a few pictures of that development towards the end too. But moving swiftly along, you can see that when you're on the foothills looking over Guatemala City, beyond and to the west, you can see that there's a whole chain of volcanoes that are, a number of which are active. And beyond those volcanoes, at the base of them, is the historic city of Antigua, Guatemala, which was the capital city of the Spaniards after their conquest. So rather spectacular views, and that was something that we had to take into account while working on the master plan. The drawing on the left is the sort of interim master plan that was developed by Creer with Estudio Urbano, and the buildings in black are the ones that I had the privilege to work on, to develop, including the first of a series of public buildings, which is located here, with a view over a ravine to the city of Guatemala and beyond. So I will show you some of these images. It's important to bear in mind, since the necklace of hills or peaks along that ridge there is north-south essentially, that the parties, if you will, the diagram of this new neighborhood is linear, and it's based on three nodes. A market tower, which is roughly down here, which Leon Creer proposed and which is still intended to be built. The Civic Hall, which is the center of public activity, which I will show you shortly. And then the church, which I'm happy to say is now under construction. And I know I learned this from an enthusiastic call from Maria, who's been struggling for a long time to get this realized, all sorts of issues that they had to overcome. Here is the more complete master plan, perhaps the more recent, if you will, of this new neighborhood, Paseo Cayalá. And as you can see here, you would have the market tower by Creer, the Civic Hall, and the church here forming the main paseo, which is the Spanish word for promenade or main street. And you can see that there are a number of existing highways in the area that from which they've been designed to lead to entrances to the site. One at the south, one on the east, and one at the north end. This is a Google Earth close-up of the town, just showing you what it looked like a few months ago. And you can see that the residential areas beyond the civic core is under construction. And here you can make out the construction site of the church, the Civic Hall, and the site of Creer's Tower, which will complete the sequence, a necklace of public buildings. This is a photograph a couple of years ago showing the completed paseo or main street. And you can see that besides the intended market tower at the bottom, the Civic Hall, and the church, here what you see instead of the church is the chapel that will plug onto the back of the church. It was built first so that the local residents, and it's been fully bought out, by the way, they would have a place of worship. Anyway, the church now is under construction, but you can see that the buildings lining the Paseo are 4-story, maybe 5 sometimes. They are mixed use. In other words, they're commercial at the ground level, sometimes even on the second level, and then what happens above is residential or office, depending. And this is the southern entrance to the site. Just there to the at the top on the right is the entrance from the north-south boulevard. Now, these buildings that are outlined are the ones that I will show you if time permits and walk you through. These are the buildings that I had the privilege to work on, always in collaboration, of course, with the town architects who are Pedro and Maria, our Notre Dame alums. And this is a telephoto lens, a photo of the development as seen from Guatemala City. It's much smaller when looked at with the bare eye, but you can see here how it's developing, how this development is deploying along the ridge here of this hill. And here is the Civic Hall, and then a series of buildings that I will show you shortly that to illustrate the kind of work that I've been doing. Now, this is sort of a shocking development, really, as you can imagine, in Guatemala, but not just there, but just about anywhere. And I don't want to limit myself either to Central or South America, but anywhere, planet Earth, because not only is it a new traditional vision that's being realized, but here we have some of the first public buildings or civic buildings to be erected. You know, one of the common critiques of the new urbanism is that what happens first is the residential component, and then where is the public, where's the commercial? Well, here you have a case of the land being owned by one owner, a developer, and they simply built to the architect's recommendations, and it filled out instantly. And this is what the developer originally had in mind. That's the sort of thing that's happening in Guatemala and elsewhere, as you know. And so this vision is really rather different. I'm going to show you the public buildings. This box shows the location, the intended location of the Creer Tower at the south end of the main street, the Paseo. And here on the right, this complex of the large hall and the tower are parts of the Civic Hall. The Creer Tower, as you can see here, is going to be a very prominent, tall, and very distinctive building type that's inventive, but it also transforms familiar Guatemalan symbols like this grated window that becomes a columnar element on the facade, or this Mayan-like hat which goes on top of it. The intention being to talk to both the Spanish and the native traditions of the land. And here is a picture where you can see the Civic Hall, which was the first building I worked on in Charette in 2009. That charrette was staffed by a number of Miami architects, none of whose designs survived, and to my surprise, the Civic Hall was retained and realized. And you can see in the distance the bell tower by Pedro and Maria, and I'll tell you about the forms of these various buildings as we go along. The church at the far end of the Paseo, as designed by Pedro and Maria, probably it's been pared down a little bit, I suspect. Maybe a few less finials, I imagine, but they're very excited that they're finally proceeding with it, and you can see that it overlooks the main central square. And this is a picture of the chapel under construction behind it. and which gives a taste of the kind, or an image of the kind of architecture that to anticipate in the church as well. Again, another view up the Paseo with the mixed-use buildings, shops below, apartments above, restaurants and other shops, sometimes even at the tops of buildings. It's very animated, very active. I should get more pictures with people around. Common mistake architects make, by the way. You always photograph your buildings without people, and lay people always tell you, can you please put some people in them? So I've been a little bit more careful since then. I also wanted to point out that there are some pictures you will notice that do not have the proper moldings on the buildings. That's because there was an inaugural back in 2011 for the complex, and the moldings weren't done. So they put up fake moldings that weren't even painted. So when you look at pictures from that time, the buildings look a little unfinished. But this is the finished view of the Civic Hall. And I'm just going to say, before I proceed, that as you can tell, it's a sort of a hybrid building. It's a number, volumetrically, it's composite. And there are a number of elements that make very deliberate a symbolic reference to both Spanish and Mayan architectural features that are common in Guatemala. Guatemala had a terrible civil war not that long ago. Very recently, they were essentially, it was the haves and the have-nots, but basically it broke down to the Mayans and the Europeans. They are going through a period now of a sense of great unity and purpose, and the owner is, his family hails from both ethnic groups, European and native, and so this building, he very much was looking for something that could stand as a symbol of the unity of Guatemala, that people could rally around rather than Spanish or Mayan. Now, these are the plans. You can see the elevations and the plans. It ended up being, it was a freestanding building originally, and it ended up being an L-shaped building to hold a corner. So therefore it began as a foreground building, and it ended as a fabric building that defines an urban corner. And we'll show you some pictures walking around. This is the first perspective that I shared with the client way back when it was the charrette, and you can see that it was still a freestanding object. And he was taken by it, and that's one of the reasons it survived the first charrette. And a number of other buildings from that first charrette, which are no longer part of the scheme. Here is the building, not quite finished, under construction, and you can see how it does turn the corner there to hold that corner, but also make a small public square, and how the various volumes break down. This is an early sketch in which it was an attempt to illustrate the complexity of the building, the typological complexity of the building. Some of you will now remember our discussions of Westfall and various other ways of thinking of volumes and such. And here you have all sorts of components. They're not the civic types, but the pergola, the market pavilion, the pyramid, the cupola, the market hall. Those are all precedents that I will talk about briefly. Here is the building with the faux cornices for the inaugural, which I think catches the light very nicely and shows the Mayan pyramid. By the way, the same number of steps from the bottom to the top as there are days in the Mayan calendar. So it was all part of a studied scheme. And this is the finished product, a photograph taken just last year, I believe. And you can also see, besides the other references I mentioned, you can see a corner condition here, which is very typical in Guatemala. Now, of course, you all know that the Mayans built pyramids. I don't have to say that, but it was something that struck me immediately after visiting the country and flying to the Yucatan Peninsula, and especially visiting the archaeological site at Tikal. And you would think this is a long-gone civilization, but they still speak the language and they still worship on pyramids, believe it or not. Here's an example of a Mayan pyramid on top of which sits a Spanish colonial church, rather imposing edifice. And the Mayans, who are all Catholics now, still sacrifice chickens on the steps of the pyramid. So they've managed to fuse their religions, their religion with Christianity, and in a way it defines the culture. But this image, especially the Church of Santo Tomás at Chichicastenango, was a very, very powerful one for me anyway. And that was the inspiration for the approach, the ascent to the pavilion at the top of the pyramid steps at Cayalá. Now, there were other influences. For instance, it was a market building. It's a civic hall, but it sits on top of a market building. And of course, market buildings, there are Spanish examples, but I was especially very similar to the one I'm showing you here on the left, which you all recognize as the Charleston Market Hall. This seemed to me to have a very civic, and it was just laden with civic iconography, and so it was immediately part of that discussion with the client. Because we didn't want to surmount the pyramid steps with a church image, of course, which is what they would have been familiar with. We wanted to make it very clear that this is not a sacred building. It is a market and civic hall. And you can see here how the arcade lining the edge of the market hall was the influence, the reference here. But this pavilion draws inspiration also from the building, the Enskede, the cemetery chapel at Enskede by Sigurd Leverance. You can see what's amazing about this building is that the portico, which is very canonic, if you will, as viewed on approaching it, as you round the corner, you realize that it's actually a freestanding pavilion. And that was the intention here, to do exactly that, to abut this market hall with this pavilion so that this is actually detached. Unfortunately, structurally, we couldn't quite do it. It's very earthquake-prone country, so they had to tie it back, but they stepped it back so that the illusion is essentially a leverance-like condition. And that shows you the pavilion. Again, the faux molding's not quite done yet in this picture, but you can see how it had to attach. Another interesting precedent reference is the one here, the interior. This is the first sketch shared with the client for the Great Hall. And the idea was to create paneling up to a certain height that would recall Spanish jungle forts, and that looming up over the paneling would be a fresco of a jungle scene. And of course, the great paintings by Catherwood of Mayan ruins was the reference here. The client every now and then nods and says, yes, they'll do it, but they're looking for an artist. I don't know. If anybody knows an artist, let me know, who would have time to paint this. And these are just construction drawings that were shared. Now, the method of working was, I worked traditionally, manually. I produced the working drawings, some of which looked like this. They were then translated by the client's in-house architect, and usually they were butchered horribly, and so there was a very laborious redlining process, which was very stressful and time-consuming, and that's all changed now because the client realized that there was just no way to go forward. And so, as Frank Hutterwitz, who's with us here, knows very well, who's been assisting with the recent work, it's all being done this way, then translated in our team as into computer drawings. But inevitably things go wrong, and you have to be very vigilant. And these are images that were faxed, or not faxed, scanned and sent to the client in desperate attempts to repair things that were going wrong, explaining what a pediment is and how it should, what that split fillet really is, brackets and such. And I soon discovered in my frustration that the one thing they have in Guatemala that's fantastic is amazing carpenters, unbelievable carpenters, and I'll show you. They took these drawings and they did better than anything we architects could conceive. So, giving them a picture of the Parthenon acroterion. This was originally called the Athenaeum, so the reference to the Parthenon was deliberate. And they did a better job, I think, than the original drawing that I sent them. And then the brackets here for the ceiling, beautifully executed, unbelievable. Yes, the bases were round. This is Tuscan, that's the Edicule. But if you open book 4 of Vitruvius, he describes the Tuscan as having a round plinth. It was a mistake, but it's legitimate, I guess. So these things happen. Another thing that had a lot of fun was contemplating the capitals as a symbol. I mean, they were meant to be Ionic at one point, and then Corinthian, and then, of course, once they became Corinthian, the client was asking, well, how can you make them very Guatemalan? And the answer was, just go to the museums and you'll find representations of corn all over. Their maize god, I forget the name of the maize god, but at any rate, that was a big deal. And so the inspiration obviously then next fell onto Latrobe's Capitol building capitals. And here is Maria Sanchez happily supervising the local sculptor's work. And this is the final result. It came out very nicely. And here you see the side facing Guatemala City. The pergola is intended to enhance the views out towards the volcanoes. And if you're wondering about this tower, originally there was a kitchen at the base and a restaurant at the top. That's changed, unfortunately, but that set the thought process was, well, if it's a kitchen, well, in Guatemala, you have this tradition of kitchen towers, which are octagonal for the most part, and they're all over. They're just ubiquitous. These are pictures from Antigua, Guatemala, nearby. And of course, that was the inspiration. It's too bad that the kitchen is no longer below, but it does house an elevator, so maybe, it's just the verticality is justified. And then the pergola itself, plenty of examples in Guatemala. They tend to be focused around main squares or courtyards, but this one was bigger than anything that had ever been built ever in the history of Guatemala, so something had to be done. And it just so happened, we were back and forth, that when I first got the summons to begin the design of this building, I was in this hotel in upstate New York. And looking out the window, I sketched this bracket, which ended up being what we went with. The client loved it. So there's a little bit of upstate New York, kind of grand old Victorian hotels there. It's okay. They loved it because they thought it looked very Guatemalan. I said I had no idea how that happened, but at any rate. Anyway, there's some more pictures. These buildings by Maria and Pedro complete the Paseo, looking south from the completed Great Hall, Civic Hall. And looking north now, you will head north along the shops at the ground floor, and you'll see a number of buildings, mixed-use buildings that I was happy to work on in the very first initial stages, and then the buildings beyond as well, turning the corner into the main square. So these buildings were interesting because although all the components that we decided, and what we did with Pedro and Maria and Leon is come up with a kind of a palette of architectural motifs that we would reference. And the country is full of beautiful pergolas, but there are no buildings of this type, this mixed-use type with pergolas along the street does not exist. This is a brand new type. And so this is the first time a traditional Spanish-type pergola is actually lining a street as opposed to a public square in Guatemala. I'll tell you more about those buildings. But if we walk north along the Civic Hall, you can see this L-shaped is a series of shops which we call the North Shops, which are really part of the Great Hall complex. And you can see that they've been broken down into very distinct buildings. I was asked to make them so that 3 bays could potentially be purchased and acquired by an entity, and so therefore it would want to look like a single building. And here are the original drawings before they were translated digitally. You can see the pencil work here. They survive pretty intact. And then here, views on the north side, turning the corner. The colonnades are continuous. In Guatemala, it rains every day of the year for half an hour at noon on the clock. It's amazing. I'm joking, but it's very frequent and it's very brief. And so shopping can be interrupted by this rain. And so colonnades were just natural, and people found themselves asking, why didn't we do this 400 years ago? Why is it only this public squares that this happens? Well, the answer is that that's where the shops were located, and so it makes perfect sense to extend the typology along the street edges wherever there is commercial. Some more pictures of this, the North Shops and the little square with a fountain by Leon Creer. You can see the various details. Some of them not exactly as I might have wished. These balconies were meant to be wood, but they were cast in concrete. And the columns, here's some sketches, sent urgently to the folks there. Obviously one can't constantly travel there, but so there's a lot of scanning and sending just to explain what is exactly meant when handling corners like that. And if you're wondering about the thickness of the columns, the Spanish adapted their architecture so that they could handle the constant earthquakes that you find in Guatemala. And so the columns almost look like they're from an analytique with a truncated type of architecture. Very, very massive, wonderful, wonderful, solid-looking structures. This is one in Antigua, Guatemala. And you can see that's exactly where that was all coming from. More North Shops, more sketches, development sketches, and if these kinds of drawings weren't made, they wouldn't have understood it. And that's the thing you have to realize if you're a student and planning to be an architect. The ability to sketch is one of the best things you'll ever do is to develop, because you will find all sorts of misunderstandings cropping up all over sites if you don't have total supervision. And the ability to make a quick sketch and send it to them sometimes can save the day. When they see this, they will know exactly what to do. And then another colonnade there. As Caroline mentioned, we're lucky to get a Palladio Award for this and publicity. Let's walk north of the Civic Hall now to this building here, which is J4, a corner building with a tower to serve as an urban node, and then to kind of slowly ease you into the main square with the Church of St. Mary that's under construction. This row of buildings right to the tower are the ones that I was in charge of. And you can see very quickly here, there's some very early drawings of a house which didn't survive, but which the tower was adapted for the purpose. Some more development drawings. And this is J4 and J5 buildings. And you can see that it's, again, this sort of playful mix of sheer plaster walls and timber work. And that's the beauty of the Spanish tradition, which I knew nothing about until I went to Guatemala, is that it's this incredible vernacular architecture that has these classical moments that just burst forth upon the wall. So you'll be going along and you get all these sort of undulating, simple surfaces, and then suddenly there's this concentration of formality just kind of that happens around a doorway or even a window. That's pretty amazing. This was the first building to build, and as they built it, it became clear to us that it was looking rather horizontal. Nice, but I was a little worried that that was going to create, if that continued, they wanted colonnades upstairs on the next building over, that it was going to end up creating a very horizontal effect. So the next building, J4, this is J4, J5 I should say. Where am I going backwards? I guess yeah, J5 here. The trick to avoid the horizontality of this was to extend the columns down onto brackets, and that overlap does create that sense. I'm fairly happy with the result of verticality where it was counterindicated by the architecture. And then this building had an amazing view beyond of the volcanoes, and so of course the windows were all about capturing that view. And there's a nighttime shot there of the town in action. You know, I find these things online, they're amazing, and better photography than our own. And then the last building on that sequence there is one that faces the public square where the church will overlook. And these are various development sketches for a tower, but the problem was, we want a tower, said the client, so we can view Guatemala City, but it should not compete with the bell tower, right? Because that's the church, right? So this kind of an exuberant first start was nixed, and then it became a rather plainer affair. And so I got a little bit of, derived a little bit of the lost fun by just kind of concentrating on some of the smaller chimneys that were built. And this building was designed to front a square which really, where the church overlooks, and so we agreed that it could have it would have a little niche, and Maria Sanchez promptly found a perfectly sized statue of Mary and put it in the niche. I don't know where she found it, but it fits perfectly, overlooking. And below there are shops and apartments above. This is the square. This is where the church will be located. There's a statue, a bronze statue of John Paul II. And you can see here the buildings that I just described, and the volcanoes in the distance. Constant emails back and forth coming in saying, you know, quick, we need a scheme because the owner of the restaurant downstairs has done something horrendous. Just put a bunch of umbrellas, and, you know, there's all this constant sketching that has to take place. And we even did a sketch for a fountain. I'm not quite happy, I think, the results. Not quite happy with this one, but this was based on a Turkish fountain that I'm familiar with in the town of Nafplion. Michael will probably immediately recognize it. And then two other buildings really quickly up the Paseo, which were the first attempts to define a mixed-use type with the colonnades. And you can see the sketches to explain to them where to the structure, how it'll be clad, and how the structure will appear. Concrete slab, but we wanted to dress it with wood so it looked structural. And then the example of computer-generated drawings that were done by the in-house architect. And then one other last building on the Paseo, overlooking the little square by Creer, the penthouse at the very top, various Guatemalan details. The painting was a surprise. Last time I went, some local person thought they should do it, and you kind of let these things happen, and it just kind of evolves. That's the fountain designed by Leon Creer. And then here are some recent projects extending out into the to the north of and west of the town, largely Maria and Pedro with Leon's designs. And these are the urban awards that the master plan received. IMCL, the Acanthus Award. Now, last three slides, very quickly. The neighborhood of Cayalá is here. Along that necklace of neighborhoods, that other neighborhood now under development, the El Socorro neighborhood, Frank Hutterwitz has been working on this with me together, and this is the first urban quarter or area to be built facing a public square, and these two buildings here were the ones we worked on here and here. And you can see how it's developing based on a grid. And these are drawings. I'm not showing the digital drawings quite yet, but you can see here the design for the one facing north, building 1A, and then this is a larger building to the south, building 8F. And that's it. I realize it's very little time and we have to start getting ready, but there's 5 minutes left. I thought perhaps, unless, because I don't think we're as rushed as we were. So I thought I'd end there with a painting by Frank Catherwood, but I'll be happy to take you back to a more general view, just to show you there. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to ask you. Yes?
It sounds like there were some kind of on-the-fly architectural changes. I was wondering if there were any changes in the master plan after the buildings started getting built. Was there any iteration?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, there have been, and for example, when the first phase was completed, the client realized that, and the chapel hadn't been built, they didn't have a chapel, so they went to Creer and they said, we need a public building that will serve as a pergola, but for now we can use it as a chapel. And so they built a pergola, I forget where, but anyway, it's just to the right here in the master plan. You might see it right. There's the main square with the church, the civic building. It's I believe it's this building here. That serves, and I don't have a picture of it, but it serves as a temporary. So that changed the master plan. Another example was this little square here had a fantastic old plane tree or fig tree. And it was carefully built around, and then it died. So what do? Well, now it's turning into a different, now it's gone from a park to a plaza, so those are the kinds of things that happen, yeah. I don't know if any other questions. Yes, Steve?
Well, first of all, congratulations. It's really inspiring. But I was curious because some of the imagery reminded me of my hometown of Pearl Gables, Florida.
Sure.
Or the work that Meisner did in Palm Beach. And I just wondered to what extent any of those precedents have been on your minds.
Some of those precedents were on our desks, actually. Anything Spanish, anything part of that wonderful, Mediterranean, Moorish, whatever you want to call it, a tradition was fair game. But of course, we wanted it to be not too alien to the locals, because every one of those countries, Mexico is a little different. They have these nuances. Here, it's very Mayan, and so that was really our intention. Yes, Michael.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
What Stephen said about the marvelous project. What I find very intriguing is this notion of the migration of ideas and identities, and how you've merged the Mayan and the Spanish, and actually even the New England, how ideas and forms move throughout time.
Right.
I think it's a great example of that.
It was a typological playground for us because, really, the real challenge was that we were dealing with unknown types to Guatemala. I mean, these long mixed-use buildings required, if we were going to keep within the language, it required some kind of adaptation. And so precedent was almost like a lifeline for us. We were just grabbing onto anything we could to kind of keep cohesion. And it was an amazing process. So, yes?
How is the project continuing as you talked about the overall master plan, neighborhood stuff? How much of that do you think will actually get built out? I want to sort of like the next step.
Right now, they're finishing the church, and the Cayalá itself is pretty much filled out. We're continuing now. Once the church is done, we're going to shift focus entirely on this new area of El Socorro, and that is an open site with no existing buildings. So it'll be a chance to do what we did here. In other words, build it, and if you build it, they will come, and they did come. And everything between these two built-out new neighborhoods is a harder proposition. That's where we have to, it's going to be a long process of the client acquiring pieces of land from neighbors to make sure that the roads can happen and this and that. That's going to be more laborious, and over time probably will be long gone, and maybe your generation can continue, but that's probably more like it. But yeah. Any other? Oh, another one. Yeah. Yeah. About the ongoing work or construction? Yeah.
Oh, I was wondering, as you talked about this first, that Guatemala and a lot of the world has seen work like this. How has it been received? Has this work inspired any other communities or
Right. The first thing that happened after this was built or published was all the mainstream modernist trained architects attacked it. And there's a whole bunch of publications that are basically decrying it as this or that. But then a whole series of awards began to roll in, and all the kind of lay press was extremely favorable because it was not a gated community. A lot of kind of faux traditional gated community. This one, the client said it's open to everybody. So there are no gates. People just are welcome. The proof of its success is not just the crowds that swarm it every evening. When people are done with work, they just head out there from Guatemala City. The real proof is the number of copycat attempts that are happening all over Guatemala now. People trying to go back to that whitewashed, tiled Spanish colonial look, and they may not be doing it very sophisticatedly, but it's evidence that they want that. And of course, there's only 2 architects in Guatemala who can do it, or maybe 3. So the architects are failing them, unfortunately. But you have to keep at it. You have to just keep. But I mean, I think the beauty, as I said, for me, the beauty of this tradition is that it is this. It's very urban. It's completely merges and blends. It's about continuum, and the vernacular and the classical sit side by side, but they do not divorce themselves from each other. They kind of just hold hands. It's this incredible continuum. Unlike our other Western traditions, for instance, where you'll have, shop, church, and then you continue. Here, it's the same wall, but the entrance is this. And in a way, you see that in the Gothic. There's a bit of a medieval quality to that. But it's here you go from plaster wall to page whatever of surly. It's that sort of thing. Of course, we're being more inventive. We're not just trying to replicate. We're using the language. That's the intention. Staying true to the language, but not necessarily replicating. That's the idea. Yeah.
how is the price point the residential units compared to the private block type lobby that they want to build?
The pricing. Where's Maria to bail me out on this one? There are some things that are, I would say, maybe a little unfortunate. The first thing the client said, they're very Catholic. They're very devout family. The owners. Their money comes from sugar plantations, and so they're kind of driven by this sort of moral vision in a way. And he wanted, Hector Leal wanted X number, or 10%, 15% of this development to be low income, which is how we designed it. We designated it. But of course, before anybody could realize what was happening, that was all bought out by people who could. And so that is a critique. In other words, there should have been some kind of way of halting the rush. People were just wanted to get out of Guatemala City because it is crime rife, and you know, it's got its issues. So congestion, whatever, and so it just all got bought out real quick. So that's a problem of new urban developments. Period. It's something for you all to be careful of. You know, in England, 10% has to be, it's designated. Anything you build, if it's an urban development larger than X square feet, 10%, I think at least, has to be affordable housing. And it's kind of, they ensure that's what happens. But here, because it was private land, privately owned, it's something, and even the client laments that. He says, I can't believe we let that slip. Maybe in the new neighborhood that'll happen. The El Socorro will be a chance to rectify that mistake. So, yeah. So, yeah. Maybe the last one, because I've got a pin up to go to.
How was the car treated in the plan as far as how everything plays out?
Very good question. It's worth staying and missing my pinup. No, the car, originally we were all drawing sidewalks. And one day Creer arrived from Spain on a flight and came to a charrette, and he said, what are you doing? And we said, that's the master plan. He says, get rid of the sidewalks. He said, it's all a sidewalk. I said, you mean no cars? He goes, no, cars wherever they want, and pedestrians wherever they want. Just get rid of all distinctions. And we thought this was mad, but the client finally relented, and they basically just paved all the roads with cobbles. And the cars, the minute they leave the highway and enter, they just inching along, terrified that they're probably driving on some pedestrian road. And they go very slowly, and everybody's happy. There's this sort of natural speed control that happens because of just the texturing of the road. And the minute you hit those cobbles, which are deliberately rough so that the cars can feel it, they slow down. And it's an amazing device. And the pedestrian feels that it's their land, it's theirs to use, and the car is an intruder. It helps that underneath the whole place, really quickly here, under this entire area here, most of the buildings have parking below. It really helps. So you go under, you enter parking in a number of spots. Here's one, there's another, I forget, but it's incredible. And you surface in these beautiful little pavilions, and you know, where are those pavilions? I'll just show you one, a little underground pavilion. I think it's here. Yeah. I believe that's one designed by Maria Sanchez. Right. My students are waiting there. Thank you very much.